Bible Answers
with Dr. Al Garza.
Hi, welcome back to Bible Answers. I'm your host, Dr. Al Garza. So today, I want to kind of just talk to you guys, the viewers, some of my subscribers, dealing with, why I make certain videos on certain topics like Calvinism and other videos. So I want to kind of be a little more casual with you, a little more candid, and kind of explain to you where I'm coming from with my positions. It's interesting because I do get a number of emails, a number of messages, whether it's through my website or on Facebook or here on YouTube, even in the comments section. And I get questions regarding, if I'm so correct about my area of non-Calvinistic theology with dealing with soteriology and other areas, why don't I debate, or call out certain Calvinistic scholars, whether it be white or anybody else. And here's the thing. I don't care to debate. I rather have discussions. I probably, if I was asked to debate or have a debate with somebody, either maybe like James White or somebody else, I would say no, thank you. I don't mind having discussions or talk about certain topics or areas, and maybe have an open discussion on it either privately. And I've invited people who've messaged me. I've said, hey, shoot me an email. We can schedule a call or something, and maybe talk about this stuff in private and go over some things. And about, I'd say every time it's been they've kind of declined and said no, okay, thank you, I appreciate the offer, but no. So I've put it out there. I'm always willing to have discussions. In fact, I did have one really extreme Calvinist, and he's been on YouTube, and a lot of people know who he is. He's well known. He's not a scholar or anything, but he's really boisterous about his position, and he's been in debates with people. And he called me up. He actually sent me an email. We scheduled a phone call, and he called me up, and we talked for about a good 15, 20 minutes. But what happened was, the minute we started discussing my position and how he was not really educated in that area, because we do have opposite views on a number of things, but even though he's a Reformed Calvinist, he was not familiar with, or that familiar or studied in my area. So he didn't really have much to say. We didn't really talk about too much. But from that point on, because he was thinking about having me on his show or having me on his, or having some kind of discussion, and of course he never got back to me and kind of left it at that. And that's usually the position. So let me explain to you the huge difference on why I will not debate people on these issues. I'll talk about and have discussions, and I will call out errors as I see them, but I will not debate them as far as a formal, because there's too much difference in other areas. Let me give you an example. Talking to a lot of Reformed Calvinists, and even some non-Christian scholars and non-Christian believers who aren't familiar with the changes in direction with New Testament understanding, people tend to dismiss things that I say. Now, there's a difference between how the Western Reformed Calvinists and Protestants position is versus the scholars in the East and in Israel and so forth. There is a difference how they view the Scriptures and the New Testament. But there's a lot of changes and updates in Israel that has not yet completely reached people out here in the U.S. on what's going on. So when I get people telling me, hey, don't you know that Jesus and the apostles, they quoted the Septuagint and they read from the Septuagint? That alone is completely and utterly false. Yes, that was probably thought, or that idea was in the academic field 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, and it has not changed. But that does not make it true. With the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and studying more into Jewish sources and studies regarding first century Second Temple era, and how there were Hebrew Jews and there were Greek Jews, and they were not intermixed as far as association until you get to Acts 6:1, where there was already division starting amongst those believers of Greeks and Hebrew Jews, or Greek Jews and Hebrew Jews. Right there tells you there's two groups. But let me stress this. That idea that they quoted and used the Septuagint is not accepted in Israel. These are the scholars in Israel who are doing the work on the very land and field. And they'll tell you from the evidence, looking at Emmanuel Tove's work and other scholars there, that Jesus spoke Hebrew as his mother tongue. It was not Aramaic, which we're going to discuss a little bit. He did not use the Septuagint, or they did not read from them at the local synagogues or at the temple. They would have never put Greek pagan texts in the temple or at the synagogues. They used what is called today the Proto-Masoretic text. Now, what that is that we have the Masoretic text using the Aleppo and the Leningrad Codex for our Bibles that we translate from Hebrew to English. And the text that we have found, the Hebrew text that we have found in Israel, or that they have found in Israel, relate 95+% accuracy to those within the Judea desert. So we know just from the Dead Sea Scrolls of over 5,000 manuscripts found, of Hebrew manuscripts found versus the small number of Greek and Aramaic texts in Jewish communities, tells you that Hebrew was a well-spoken language. The texts were being used, and Jesus and the apostles, being Hebrew Jews, not Hellenistic Jews, would have used the Proto-Masoretic text at the temple and at the synagogue to read and study, as well as speaking Hebrew, not Aramaic, and I'm going to show that in a minute. Let me give you an example how things change. Now, I utilize this because in my book, and I deal with this because a lot of Calvinistic, believers, Calvinist Reformed believers and scholars tend to keep saying, and even Christian scholars, I'll be honest, even people like Dr. Michael Heiser, who makes the same error of saying, yes, they quoted and read from the Septuagint, and you have others as well, well-known Christian scholars, even Dr. Michael Brown, who's, he's open to all this, saying, yeah, he probably did speak Hebrew, and yeah, he's more open because he knows that things can change in the scholarly circle. Things get discovered, and we see things differently. But if you're not open in that field, then that's a problem. But let me show you something here. In my book, More Than a Rabbi, I document this, and I want to quote this because it's very, very interesting. And most people don't know this. There was a position that changed regarding this. So let me pull this up real quick here. Bear with me. Okay, so let me read to you from the 1958 first edition of the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church. And this is what they said. Hebrew ceased to be a spoken language around the 4th century BC, and that was their conclusion. Hebrew ceased to be a spoken language around the 4th century BC. And in their 1997, in its 3rd edition, they changed it. They said Hebrew continued to be as a spoken and written language in the New Testament period. So the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church, first edition of the Christian Church, and of course in their 3rd edition, has 2 different changes. One, they contested that Hebrew had ceased to be a spoken language. And then in their 3rd edition, when the Dead Sea Scrolls and all these things started really proving otherwise, they made a change in saying Hebrew continued as a spoken and written language. So think about that for a minute. And this is what most people don't consider. If the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church made that change and understood that at one point the belief was that Hebrew ceased, and therefore that's why people said, well, then Jesus probably spoke Aramaic and probably used the Greek Septuagint because Hebrew didn't exist and the language wasn't spoken or being written. So I could understand that conclusion. So think about that. But the minute that position changed based on the evidence, which is in my book, I lay it out by scholars, it's not my opinion. The minute it changed, Oxford recognized that they had to make the change. But guess what? A lot of reformers and a lot of Christian scholars fail to make that same change. They are still repeating the same outdated sources that don't exist. So when that is believed that Hebrew ceased, they hold on to Aramaic and they hold on to the Septuagint. Now think about this. Now reformers and even a lot of Christians, they're based on logic and reasoning, and let's get to the facts. But let's narrow this down. You really want to believe, think about this, you really want to believe that Jesus was speaking to his disciples in Aramaic, And then in the middle of his Aramaic speaking, he transitions to quote the Septuagint. So he starts speaking Greek in the Septuagint and quoting the passages in Greek. And then the disciples decide to write this down in the Gospels, like Matthew, Mark, and John. So they decide, hey, Jesus said it in Aramaic, but I'm going to write it in Greek, and I'm going to reference the Greek Septuagint. I mean, think about that. That's what you want people to believe. When you really look at it, if you're living in the first century and you're there, you're thinking Jesus is speaking Aramaic, and then he starts going into the Greek Septuagint and speaking Greek. And then when I decide to write it down as an apostle, I'm gonna skip the Aramaic and not write it in the language it was written and spoken in, and I'm just gonna write it all in Greek. Uneducated men. Again, that makes no sense. We know that the Hebrew Proto-Masoretic text was being used at the temple and at the local synagogues, read by Jesus, quoted by Jesus, and used by the disciples when they went, and by Paul also, who was a Hebrew-speaking Jew. He knew Aramaic. Most people don't know this, but in the New Testament, he references the Aramaic, and it's in my book. People don't know that. He references the Aramaic, and that proves that he knows Aramaic. And of course, he spoke Greek, because why? Even the guard was shocked in Acts. You know Greek? Because Paul was going to speak to his people, his brethren, not his people, but his brethren, in Hebrew. Not Aramaic, not Greek, but in Hebrew. And the guard was like, you speak Greek? It wasn't as common as people think, unless you were a Hellenistic Jew and you adapted the Greek culture. And there's a lot of things with that in the history that people don't even know about, how to identify both the Hebrew and the Greek Jew. But even Jesus spoke to Paul on the road to Damascus. Paul says that he spoke to him in Hebrew. Okay, that is what we know. It was not Aramaic and it was not Greek. There were Hebrew Jews and Greek Jews. So even the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church recognizes that. And to all my Calvinist friends and people out there, why don't you recognize that? Why don't you understand that? And here's what I think. This is my opinion. I think honestly because if they adapt that, okay, Jesus spoke Hebrew, he read Hebrew scriptures, some of the New Testament and a number of areas, they probably wrote it in Hebrew as well as being translated into Greek for the Greek Jews. They'd have to take the Greek scripture premise of the superiority that they hold above even the Hebrew and either level it out with the Hebrew or bring the Hebrew above it. And then their whole theology would have to change and have to relook at everything from the lens of the Hebrew text and the first century Jewish mindset, not the Hellenistic Greek Jew. So I think there's a lot to lose for them, and that's why they don't. Specifically, like Dr. James White and Piper and Michael Heiser and all these people, and then in the different realms of scholarship. And believe me, I was in that camp before I went to complete my associate scholar program through Hebrew University's Israel Institute of Biblical Studies in linguistics, dealing with Hebrew, Aramaic, and New Testament Greek, and also studying Jewish culture, context, context, as well as Hebrew and as well as the Jewish New Testament studies, which took me a number of years to finally complete, along with my PhD work, my doctoral with my PhD. There's a lot that I was not aware of, that when you look at the research in Israel that's going on and all these things that are coming up, we know that there is no evidence for a first century Jewish teacher or rabbi who spoke parables, there's no evidence that he spoke parables in any other language other than Hebrew. You look at all the Jewish sources for teachers of the first century, and the language they spoke in parables was Hebrew, not Aramaic and not Greek. So Yeshua, Jesus, would have spoke Hebrew in the form of parables, as all first century Jewish teachers did and rabbis. We know this. We know this now. There is no evidence for anything otherwise. Again, this is evidence. This is not me. Now, good textbook I recommend. These books are pricey. I go by scholarly sources. My library that wraps around my office here, like anybody else, I've spent tens of thousands of dollars on textbooks, academic research books, a lot of different materials. Another one is The Language Environment of the First Century Judea by Brill. Great book. It is pricey. It's probably going to cost easily over $100. Some places I think it's almost close to 200 or more now. But this is a great book. It's well documented on the first century, more up to date on the what's being presented out of Israel and on their discoveries of the language at that time. And Hebrew was there and flourishing, written and oral form. And Yeshua was a Jewish Hebrew speaking rabbi, not only just a son of God, which I believe. These are not essential things that we're denying. These are non-essential issues we can talk about. So this is evidence, and it does sometimes bug me that a lot of Christians, whether you're a student of the Scriptures or you're a scholar, do not want to look at. They don't want to update themselves on what's going on or consider that they could be wrong. We do have, and they're cataloged. They're just not been printed yet because they're still being studied and being authenticated. We do have Hebrew New Testament texts. Now, we know some are from a translation from another Indo-European language, maybe Latin or Greek. We know some of them aren't written originally in Hebrew, go back to an earlier Hebrew source. But there are a number of the Gospels and Paul's letters and even Revelation and some of the epistles in Hebrew that are being authenticated and looked at to see if they are from a translation. And some of them we can, for certainly say, and I have some of them on my computer and digitally, got them. Some of them, not all of them. That some of them that do go back to an earlier Hebrew text, even at the time of Jerome or before Jerome. And I say that not because I'm trying to stir the pot here, but because the evidence suggests and shows. Just like we look at Greek New Testament texts, and by the way, 94 to 95% of the majority of the New Testament Greek texts do not show up until until the 9th century on. So these are all also a lot of majority latecomers, just like these Hebrew texts can be dated 12th century, 13th century, 14th, 15th. But they point to an earlier Hebrew source, just like those Greek texts that are dated after 1,000 years, same time frame, can point back to an earlier Greek source. Jerome, in his commentary of Matthew, he points to when he was looking at a Hebrew and a Greek text of Matthew, he points out those variants and differences. Well, guess what? Some of those variants are in those very Hebrew Matthews we have that are located in Oxford. They're located in the Jewish in New York, in the Jewish Theological Seminary. They're there on display, cataloged. We have some at the Vatican Library. We have some at the Hebrew University Library, digitally taken. These aren't, these are just like Greek texts scattered around, now being pulled out and re-examined to see if they can be shown to come from an earlier Hebrew source. And some of them are. They're not a translation from a Greek or a Latin. I have some of them. I've looked at them. There's no way they can come from a Greek or Latin text. There's things in there that only that show that they've been written from a Jew, from a rabbi, probably a believing Jew, obviously, if they're reading the New Testament. And they point to an earlier Jewish source tradition, even the time of Jerome or before. So these are things that we need to consider and we need to look at. If we don't, then we can come up with, again, we can ignore a lot of the Greek New Testament texts and make the same arguments. We can't do that. Every text that comes to us in support of the New Testament needs to be examined and looked at and considered, not just dismissed because it goes against what you traditionally believe. Like, oh no, Jesus used the Septuagint and quoted from there, the apostles, and they wrote it originally in Greek. There can't be any Hebrew text. That's the premise. Without looking at the evidence, people will dismiss it, and this is what saddens me, is that we get these New Testament texts in Hebrew. We get them, we look at them, we examine them, and yet they're automatically dismissed before anybody even looks at them. I have people telling me online, oh, those aren't real, they're fake. Really? If you looked at them, are you a scholar who are examining the text, or are you just babbling off because it might hurt your position? It might hurt your theory or your belief that the apostles had to write all in Hebrew, and they had to write all in Greek, and there can't be any Hebrew text. No, sorry. You had Hebrew-speaking Jews. We know that Hebrew was being spoken and written in the first century. We know there are Hellenistic Jews doing the same thing. There's no reason you can't have both. There's no reason that Matthew wrote in Hebrew for the Jews and it was translated into Greek for the Greek Jews. And now we can examine and make a stronger case for the authenticity of these things, and things that we can, even the differences that maybe the Greek didn't capture in its translation and its transmission, that are in the Hebrew, that settle the debate a lot of these areas. For example, we have two separate, I mentioned this before in other videos, we have two separate Matthew chapter 1 Hebrew texts, 1 through 18. One is in Oxford and one is in New York in the Jewish Theological Seminary, displayed, both of them, cataloged, and dealing with the genealogy, which a lot of people have looked at the Greek text and the Latin text and says, well, there's a contradiction. You have Matthew saying that having a different lineage back to David, because it says Mary, Joseph, the husband of Mary, and that's different from Luke, who traces Joseph as well. And so you have two different genealogies, and that's a contradiction. Obviously, they can't get that right. Well, guess what? These two separate Hebrew texts that I have on my computer, you can see on there under the genealogy, they don't have Joseph, the husband of Mary. They have Joseph Avi, father of Mary. Both of these separate texts. What does that tell you? That tells you that probably some of that passages maybe got lost, and when it's getting retranslated in transmission, the scribe maybe missed it or didn't have it and decided to put in there thinking, maybe it's the same Joseph, maybe he wrote the husband because he saw it in Luke and maybe it wasn't there. We don't know. But there's a lot of possibilities where in the Hebrew now tells us Matthew was recording the line of Mary through her father back to David, while Luke is focusing on Joseph, the husband, back to David. So both parents go right back to King David, making the Messiah going right to David in a blood lineage line. Because think about this. If you want to hold that Matthew is writing to Joseph as well, just like Luke, the husband, then the Messiah who comes through Mary, he cannot legally by bloodline go back to King David, because if Mary wasn't through that lineage and there's no recording of it, then neither is Jesus the Messiah. Because even though God is the Father who put the word into Mary, bloodline wise, Jesus would have no authority to the throne of David, because we don't have Mary's lineage. All we have is Joseph, and Joseph is not the blood relative of Jesus as far as the Father. So think about that for a minute. You can't make Jesus son of David if you have no genealogy of Mary. You can't, because that's the legitimate bloodline recognized by the Jews. But in Matthew you do, in the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. So that settles that case for me. I have two independent witnesses that say that this is Joseph, the father, Avi, of Mary, not the husband. So I think that is stronger than anything else, and that brings Jesus right into the bloodline by both parents. So these are things we need to consider. There are other things in these Hebrew texts that I'm going through myself, and there's good scholarship out there actually doing translations and verifying and authenticating to see which ones are going back to an earlier Hebrew source and which ones are from copies from another language like Greek or Latin. So that is going on, and some are showing both. Some of them are showing that these are copies. Some of them are looking at it as this cannot come from a copy. This comes from another language. It's an earlier source. So we need to be serious about our scholarship and not just biased because we have our own personal opinions and beliefs that cannot be changed. Yes, they can be changed. That's the academic world. So I think James White is a great New Testament scholar in the Greek field, in that Greek area of Reformed theology. I don't believe he's being, and just like most reformers, I don't think they're really looking. This is for me. It's kind of, they're doing things backwards. They're looking at a Calvinistic Reform position, and then trying to go back into time to fit that personal belief into the New Testament. And that's pretty much what they're doing, in my opinion. What I like to do is I can go from the Hebrew Old Testament down, look at the intertestamental writings, come back to the Second Temple period Jewish understanding of how they viewed things with all the other writings, knowing that Hebrew and there was Aramaic and there was some Greek, and I see two groups and I work from there. And I go all the way down then to the early Apostolic Fathers, and then I move further down to the Reformation and all that from there. I don't go backwards. And what I'll tell you, and what's in my book, is that Reformed theology in the area of soteriology is completely foreign to first century, Second Temple period Judaism, foreign to the Hebrew Scriptures. You cannot take a concept that starts at a later date and then push it back to the first century, which to me is what Calvinism does. But listen, I'm a supporter of James White. I like his work in other areas. I have a number of his books here. I have The Potter's Freedom. I've read it. I've used it for my book, Calvinism Challenge. I quote from this in Piper's. I have his What Every Christian Needs to Know About the Quran by James White. Great book. Another great book. I recommend it. Great scholarly source. I have both editions here, the old and the new, James White's Forgotten Trinity. Another good source to defend the Trinity. And I have other books of this. The King James Only Debate I have. So even though I disagree on his soteriology, and I vehemently disagree, if you say that, I do support his work in other areas. And that's plain and simple because, to me, they are not a cult. A cult is a religious system that denies the Trinity, the deity Messiah, the virgin birth, the resurrection, all these things that are essential to our faith and to the scriptures, both the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament as a translation and the authority of the Greek, and to me, and the Hebrew, and all the other translations we got English, it's still authoritative. It's still God preserved his authoritative words in every translation, and to me, including the Hebrew. These are non-essential disagreements we could talk about in soteriology, or if baptism, or the gift, and speaking of the gifts of the Spirit. We can disagree in-house and have good discussions. I don't think it's necessary to divide over it, or be hateful to each other over it, or attack people in a personal level in an ad hominem way of saying, "Oh well, who are you? You're no scholar." I mean, either you deal with the evidence or you just walk away. I think that's important. Everything is not my opinion. I have sources to back up everything I said. I put them in my books. I put links up. This is not my personal opinion. What I'm telling you regarding Jewish thought, Jewish positions, Hebrew New Testament texts, they are cataloged. They're coming out. They're coming out hopefully by the end of this year more and more. They do exist. So if someone says they don't exist or they're fakes, then they're just being ridiculous and they're just being argumentative because they haven't studied them. So we have to take this in consideration. We know Jesus did not quote the Septuagint. We know that for a fact. He didn't read from it. And he used the Hebrew Proto-Masoretic text of that time at the temple and the local synagogues. And so did Paul. And so did the apostles they read from. You have Hellenistic Jews in Acts 6:1 eating with the Hebrew Jews. This is before the Gentiles came in, by the way, before Peter went to Cornelius in Acts 9 and 10. They had Hebrew and Greek Jews eating together in Acts 6:1, already having divisions among each other about the widows. And these are the same. So whenever you see the word Greek, think Hellenistic Jew. When you see the word Jew, think of Hebrew Jew. This is where we get the word for Jew, and from Jew, word Judah, Yehuda, Yehudim, the Jews. So I don't mean to rant, but I think we need to be more united in these areas of and not be so dogmatic and biased as if we can't have new scholarship evidence come out, which I showed you. Even the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church recognized that yes, they were wrong. Some people call it Mishnaic Hebrew of the first century. There's a lot of different terms, some terms on that, but there's no evidence, zero evidence that Jesus spoke or Jesus quoted the Septuagint or the apostles or they spoke Aramaic. Zero evidence. Just because you have a 4th century, 3rd to 4th century Greek Old and New Testament in either the Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, in those texts, simply because you're looking and reading a Greek New Testament and then you go to that same text in the Greek of the Old Testament and say, look, they match up. That doesn't mean that was the original language or what they quoted from there. You're reading a translation of the same language in one book. It's no different if you have a Latin Bible and I read what Jesus said in Latin and then I look at the Old Testament Latin and say, oh look, they match up. He must have been quoting the Latin text. No. Just like this doesn't work for the Greek, it doesn't work for the Latin. We know what the Hebrew texts were. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have the Proto-Masoretic text fragments. We can compare them to the Aleppo and the Leningrad and the others, and we can see the accuracy. So we know there was a difference between the Hebrew Jews and the Greek Jews of the 1st century. But I want to say we need to stay united. We need to get along. I don't like to be, sometimes I get harsh myself on people because I know they haven't looked at the evidence and they're being very, ignorant on this, and they're being very attacking me, whether not just personally, but of course, anything I say, they dismiss without even looking at it. But I put a lot of it, again, in my book right here. I mean, More Than a Rabbi. You can get this free online. PDF download at my website, drlgarza.org. If you'd like to purchase it, great. You can purchase the hard copy on my website, or you can go to Amazon for the paperback. And they're all available for you, for either free or purchase. And so, I don't live off of my books. I have businesses that I have started, companies that I live off of, that the Lord has blessed and allowed me to use that to make my living. So my time goes into my studies and my ministry. That's why I went, that's why I went to get my PhD in biblical studies. That's why I went to complete my associate scholar program through Hebrew University. That's why I completed my, Jewish studies at the Israel Bible Study Center in Israel. That's why I've done all those things and spent years of research looking at what we have today and what we know versus 30, 40, 50 years ago that are outdated. So we need to come together and consider that as research, Bible students, scholars, that things change. It doesn't damage our beliefs or essentials. Sometimes it actually lifts it up and makes it stronger. And that's what I have found. These new things have increased my faith tenfold more than just looking at these people saying, oh, the Greek genealogy doesn't match up and there's these issues. And now I look at these other things, these other texts. Oh no, wait a minute. Yeah, they do add up. Yeah, they confirm in the language of the first century Jews. It's there. So there's a lot of things in my studies, whether it be Jewish studies, Western studies, regarding just standard Western scholarship. I benefited from both, and I think a lot of people can. Don't stay in one area. Branch out. Don't just stay in, I'm only going to read Western scholars like White and Piper and others, and even Heiser and other scholars in the field. No, go out and examine even non-Christian textbooks. I mean, there are great textbooks out there. They're not Christian scholars, but they're scholars in the field that are saying, here's the evidence, you decide. They're not even trying to impose their position. They're just trying to say, here's what we know, you decide. And a lot of times it supports the Christian view. It supports our faith. I look at Jewish sources and I'm reading it and I see them talking about the Messiah in Jewish sources in the Talmud and the Mishnah and all these other places. And I'm like, whoa, that's in the New Testament too. That the apostles reference that. Paul references that from the Hebrew scriptures. And I see that. So it strengthens my position that, hey, these are in Jewish sources. They knew about this stuff. And most people don't know that. And again, I put a number of it in my book. I try to list as much as I can without going overboard. I want to make it simple to read. But listen, if you do download the book for free, I ask that you just please, when you're done reading it, do an Amazon review of the book. Let me know what you think. If you buy it, please, again, do a review. That's all I ask. But I don't want to take any more of your time. I appreciate you tuning in and listening to Bible Answers, and I hope we can seriously get along here. I'll probably not post too much or make any more videos on Calvinism for a while. I might go off into other areas of different areas of the scriptures and topics and things. So unless it's something very, very dramatic that I don't agree with, but I mean, I think people get the point. So again, I want to thank you for tuning in. If you can, please like, subscribe, and share if you haven't. And then, of course, we will talk soon again, and I want to thank you again for tuning in to Bible Answers, and have a blessed day and be safe.
Bible Answers with Dr. Al Garza.